I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, this morning as I prepare to present the layout of the remaining chapters. I've been presenting material and helpful notes on how to draft your research project report or your dissertation report, because for thesis, the chapters may vary. You can have up to 10 or even 12 chapters. My own thesis has got 8 chapters. So we cannot generalize for a PhD thesis because its length depends on the research objectives and what the independent research decides to craft as the chapters. It's very rare for a PhD thesis to have 5 chapters, but for most undergraduate research projects and for most master's degree level dissertations, they tend to have 5 chapters. So I want to present the layout of the remaining chapters, which are chapter 4 and chapter 5. So for chapter 4, the first layout is the layout assuming that someone has used techniques which are deployed when gathering qualitative data, such as questionnaires, interviews, or just observation. So that's the first layout that I'm going to cover. After I'm done with this layout for, this layout for data which has been obtained from questionnaires, interviews, and observation, either participant or non-participant observation, I'll then move on to the layout for chapter 4, when someone has undertaken econometric or statistical analysis of their secondary data or even of their primary data. So I'll start with the first layout, assuming that the study followed the qualitative research approach. So just like the other subjects that the other chapters that I covered earlier on, chapter 4 has got 3 main parts, which are the introduction, the body, and the conclusion or the chapter summary. And in our department, the chapter is called or is entitled Analysis, Presentation, and Discussion of Results. I'm quite sure that those who are watching this video and they are not National University of Science and Technology students, the National University of Science and Technology of Zimbabwe, not the one which is based in Pakistan. You may have another name for chapter 4 or another title for chapter 4. But whatever the case may be, for standard undergraduate research projects, in chapter 4, we expect you to be presenting the results of your data analysis. The sort of analysis which you, by assumption, you have already described in your chapter 3, together with the data gathering techniques. So, as is the case with other chapters, the longest part of chapter 4, the analysis, presentation, and discussion of results chapter, the longest part is the body. The body has five major parts. They can be up to 10, but this is just a generic layout to assist, especially upcoming and budding researchers and those who have been tasked to undertake research projects to find it easy to come up with subtopics and a meaningful layout of their chapter 4. So the first part of the body is the response rate. We can call it the response rate or interview responses analysis of interview responses or analysis of results from observation, depending on the method which was deployed to gather primary data. The most common data gathering technique or instrument that is deployed by many researchers who gather primary data is the questionnaire, the various types of questionnaires, which we may cover in a separate lecture, time allowing us. So the questionnaire response rate, for instance, is the first thing to be analyzed there. It's just analyzed in a concise way because the questionnaire response rate does not directly speak to research objectives. So the researcher or the compiler of chapter 4 must not misdirect their effort and spend half of chapter 4 just describing how people responded to a questionnaire or to another data gathering instrument, maybe the interview schedule or participant or non-participant observation. After the response rates have been briefly and concisely analyzed, we move on to the second part of the report, which is demographic analysis of the respondents. This is especially imperative in those studies where the demographic characteristics of the respondents have an impact one way or the other on the responses that are actually given by the respondents as specified in the research objectives. Let me give you an example. Let us assume you are undertaking a study on consumer expenditure patterns in a city. It's very clear that the age of people influences what commodities they demand. Younger people are less prone to sicknesses, hence, in most cases, I mean, as a demographic group, you'll discover that there are fewer younger people who would be demanding medication and who would be going to pharmacies to buy medication compared to older people. The other example that I may give, you may discover that most younger people are actually at school. We know there are some older people who will be learning one or two courses in order to further their career or their careers. But when we look at stationery shops, the primary clients or customers of stationery shops are the parents of younger children. In essence, it's the younger children, because they will be starting out school until they finish high school. They'll be demanding a lot of stationery, ceteris paribus. So when kids are young, they normally drink this formula milk. It can be non-1 or lactogen or whatever, but they'll be taking formula milk. We don't expect a child who is 5 years old to be still taking the same thing because it's for small babies. So a demographic analysis of respondents is very important because it brings out certain nuances and certain nuggets of information which helps us to make sense of the responses to the actual issues raised in the questionnaire. And then the third part of the questionnaire is analysis of issues related to research objectives. So the crafting of subtopics to deal with this third part has to be guided by the research objectives themselves. And we expect an organized student to craft subtopics or subheadings in line with the sequencing of the research objectives, how research objectives were presented. For instance, secondary research objective number 1, we would expect it to correspond to subtopic number 1, or subtopic number 1 under the analysis of issues related to research objectives as captured in the questionnaire responses. We would expect the compiler of chapter 4 to analyze data or results pertaining to that research objective first, and then going to the second research objective they craft another subheading, they analyze issues, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 questions related to objective number 2, and so on, until they've exhausted all the objectives. Because questionnaires, the components of a questionnaire, the crux of the questionnaire, what the questionnaire actually zeroes in on, what it is attempting to gather in terms of the real issues that impinge on the research topic. Those are expected. It's expected. It's taken as, it's taken as a foregone conclusion that the student crafts their questions in line with their research objectives so that the responses will answer the research questions which are intimately related to the research objectives. So all research objectives must be exhausted within the questionnaire, which is why I was encouraging students to try by all means to keep their secondary research objectives to a reasonable minimum. Say of 3 secondary research objectives or 4, at most 5, but when the student overlaps 4 going to 5, the study becomes too broad and the issues raised, they become too many, making chapter 4 very long. And then after all the issues have been analyzed as raised in the questionnaire, the student moves on to the next phase in terms of intellectual rigor, which is hypothesis testing. Still, issues related to research objectives are still being analyzed. But unlike the basic analysis where the student is engaged in more of description than proper analysis itself, as in statistical analysis, the student will be now testing specific hypotheses which speak to the research objectives until all the research objectives are exhausted. So when a hypothesis is tested, a hypothesis will be properly mounted and then it is tested. When I'm saying hypothesis will be properly mounted, I mean the presentation of the research hypothesis. And after it has been stated, then the results of the hypothesis testing exercise, they will be presented either in a table or in a simple indented statement, a nice indented statement, which is showing us, the state of affairs as to whether we reject the H0, the null hypothesis, or we reject the alternative hypothesis, implying that we fail to reject the null hypothesis, or we accept the null hypothesis. And then we will be told the conclusion until we exhaust all the hypotheses that are speaking to specific research objectives. Or some students, they don't want to spend a lot of time under research, under hypothesis testing. They'll be having 2 or 3 research hypotheses with an SES, because there are now 3. And those 2 or 3 research hypotheses, they'll be tested one after the other, and they'll be speaking to the primary research objective. And then the student is able to conclude without crafting research objective specific hypothesis. And then after hypothesis testing has been done, the student moves on to the 5th part of their body, which is the discussion of results. And this discussion of results is in light of both the theoretical and the empirical literature. First of all, the student sort of, tries to knit together the findings from different sections of chapter 4, which is the response rate, the demographic analysis, the analysis of issues related to research objectives, and hypothesis testing as well, under the discussion. And then there is allusion to literature as well, as to whether there is convergence or divergence from the empirical literature, or there is completely new information which is being added to the literature. And then once the discussion of results has been done, and it is satisfactory or good or excellent, then the student or the researcher moves on to the research conclusion. The conclusion of chapter 4, which is also the chapter summary. So that's briefly the layout of chapter 4, the analysis, presentation, and discussion of results chapter, assuming that the student has deployed primary data gathering research instruments like the questionnaire, the interview, or observation. And once more, as I've done for the other layouts, I'll just briefly summarize the main parts. This chapter has got 3 main parts, just like other chapters. It has got the introduction, the body, and the conclusion, which is the chapter summary. And the breakdown of the main elements of the body is number 1, your response rate, which may be the questionnaire response rate, or the analysis of interview responses, or the results from observation, either participant or non-participant observation. And then number 2, it is demographic analysis of respondents. And number 3, it's analysis of issues related to research objectives as captured in different sections of the questionnaire or questionnaires. Number 4, it's hypothesis testing, which is either related to the primary research objective or related to specific research objectives. Number 5 is the discussion of the results in light of both the theoretical and the empirical literature. And then part C is the conclusion and the chapter summary. So I'm done with the first layout of chapter 4, assuming that someone was doing qualitative research. And then now we move on to the layout of chapter 4, analysis, presentation, and discussion of results chapter, assuming that the student was engaged in quantitative analysis, which may be econometric modeling, financial modeling, statistical analysis, or software programming, any methods which involve an element of, quantitative analysis of data. So again, the layout has got 3 main parts, which are the introduction, the body, and the conclusion of the chapter, which is your chapter summary. And as is the case with the other chapters, the longest part is the body, which is the heart of the chapter, so to speak. So the body has got the following 7 parts. The first part is the graphical analysis of the main schedules, your time series data, be it GDP, investment, interest rates, and so on. Let us assume you are analyzing that. It's normally the case that, the compiler of chapter 4, first of all, presents, Microsoft Excel or eViews graphs, so that the person who is evaluating that chapter 4 has got a feel of things like the trend, the short-term and the long-term trend of the time series, and also things like, the cyclical variations, the seasonal variation, and so on. When they are just looking at the time series, graphed against time. So there is graphical analysis, which is sort of a precursor to the descriptive analysis. And this descriptive analysis will be capturing things like your arithmetic mean, the range, the Jacob-Perez statistic, and the host of other descriptive statistics, which are normally presented in a simple table. And under the descriptive analysis, we normally also have a presentation of correlation statistics as well. And then the third part, which has got quite a number of subsections, is diagnostic tests, which normally precede the modeling of which normally precedes the presentation of the model parameters, the estimated model parameters. So diagnostic test results, they may be results of the following tests, which would have been deployed by the researcher or researchers. A, unit root testing. This unit root testing, it might be the augmented Dickey-Fuller test, or the Phillips-Perron test, or any one of the other, tests of stationarity of your time series data. Because for you to engage in modeling, your time series data must be stationarized. Otherwise, whatever model is estimated for non-stationary data will yield parameters which are spurious and which we can't use for forecasting purposes. And then B, we have got Johansen co-integration test. This is the test for long-run relationship, whether the long-run relationship or relationships exist among different variables. It is a fact which is known and which has been corroborated by empirical evidence that time series data, indexes or variables like GDP, interest rates, employment and unemployment figures and so on, they tend to move together, which is what is known as co-integration. So if time series are co-integrated, there are certain models that one needs to deploy. One may need to deploy a vector error correction model to correct for the co-integration. But if the time series are not co-integrated, just an unrestricted vector autoregressive model would be enough in order to deduce, your short-run dynamics among the variables, the short-run dynamics or relationships among the variables. There's the unrestricted var and the vector error correction model, which may be deployed, as well as other models that harmonize with the results of Johansen co-integration tests. If we discover that the variables are co-integrated either of order 1 or of order 2 or of order 3, or whatever the case may be, whatever models are then deployed afterwards are guided by the theoretical and the empirical literature governing the study on the topic that the student would have selected. And then C, it's Granger causality tests. We need to deploy this type of test because even if under descriptive statistics, we may discover that there is strong negative correlation or strong positive correlation. It may be the case that there is just a strong positive or negative correlation which does not suggest causality, because correlation does not suggest causation. So it becomes necessary for us to check whether the variables will be doing pairwise causality tests. That's how the Granger causality test regime actually operates in practice. It's pairwise. So to check whether there is unidirectional or bidirectional causality or no causality at all. So when you deploy the Granger causality test, you can either get unidirectional causality or bidirectional causality or no causality. If it is unidirectional, it will be from one variable to another, but not from the other variable to one variable. An example, you may discover that your GDP Granger causes changes in interest rates, but it's not the case that interest rates Granger cause changes in GDP. So that's the example that I can give. But for bidirectional causality, it means there is feedback, the feedback kind of causality, if I may put it that way. Once you have your GDP causing interest rates, the interest rates also in the intermediate or in the medium to long term, the interest rates would then cause changes in GDP. So there will be bidirectional causality, which are feedback effects of the caused variable now causing the variable that had caused its movement or changes. And then there is the collinearity tests. The collinearity tests are very important so that we can eliminate variables that appear to be more of a duplication of each other. Such variables may be like your interest rates and your inflation rate figures, because interest rates, they tend to fit into inflation statistics, or they tend to be a huge component of changes in inflation in most economies, especially advanced economies. So it may not be beneficial for a researcher to include both interest rates and the inflation rates, because the two variables, they will start to have a mathematical relationship which may distort the estimated parameters, because the ordinary least squares model assumes that there is no collinearity among explanatory variables. Collinearity being a situation where the explanatory variables have got a linear relationship, so to speak. And then we have got the different kinds of heteroscedasticity tests which you can check from the literature. Some students, they deploy heteroscedasticity tests, especially when dealing with high frequency data like your, exchange rates, your interest rates, cryptocurrency rates, Bitcoin rate, changes in a certain counter, stock returns which are traded within a certain stock market, changes in the prices of your Brent or your Texas Intermediate oil, and all of that stuff. All of these variables which are called high frequency variables, or which yield high frequency data, you discover that they are prone to, pickedness of their statistical distributions, so because there is this pickedness that we expect in their probability distributions, the heavy tails that we expect to see in high frequency data like your stock returns, your exchange rates, and all of that stuff. We have to test for heteroscedasticity. If we discover that there's heteroscedasticity, ordinary least squares would not then work in such cases. We would need to deploy models that take into account changes in the stochastic component of your model, so to speak. So you need to deploy arch and gauge models, for instance. Arch referring to autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity models, gauge being the generalized version of those autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity models. And then number 4, it's model parameter presentations after you have done your diagnostic tests, because all these diagnostic tests, they indicate to you what kind of a model you must deploy, which is why when I was talking about Johansen co-integration tests, I was saying if there is no co-integration, you deploy unrestricted VAR, which is unrestricted vector autoregressive models. But if there is co-integration, that is long-run association among your key variables, then you deploy what is known as the vector error correction model, and so on and so forth. And then where there is a collinearity, to drop one of the variables after doing the collinearity test, and where there is heteroscedasticity, if you discover that your data has got heavy tails and it tends to be seriously picket instead of platychetic, it's a leptochetic. If you discover that your data series, they produce distributions which are leptochetic instead of being platychetic or mesochetic. Mesochetic is a normal distribution. It's the shape of a normal distribution. Meso, it means middling. It means middling or medium or in between, something which is, within the two extremes of a rod, so to speak, if I may use that kind of image or analog. And then with the heteroscedastic data or data distributions, we would expect our, distribution of the data to be leptochetic, because you've got leptochetic, platychetic, which is like a plateau, and then you've got your mesochetic, which is approaching a normal distribution or a student T distribution. So once you have ascertained that there is heteroscedasticity, to deploy the arch or the gauge models or any one of the models that take into account heteroscedasticity and deal with this problem of heteroscedasticity. And then number 4, it's model parameter presentations in form of tables, and then their analysis as well. You analyze the results that are presented, introduce before drawing the table or presenting the table, and then you analyze the parameters. It may not be necessary to analyze each and every parameter, but the important ones and the salient features of whatever is presented in a table may be what is actually analyzed and briefly explained under the table. And then number 5 is robustness test results. It's very important to also present the results of, robustness tests. You can check from the literature what robustness tests accomplish, but a brief explanation of what the robustness tests are saying, and a brief statement of the results by way of a tabular presentation may assist the marker or the examiner or the assessor of the research document or research project or research, your dissertation, to arrive at a correct conclusion. And then number 6, it's forecasting test results. Those who are doing highly quantitative researches, they may be need to do in sample and out of sample within the time range and out of time range, forecasting, so that we can compare the performance of the model to the actual time series. And then we decide whether the model is robust and very responsive to changes in the time series, or the model is just too idealistic and does not really track what's happening in the random variable which is being analyzed, or in the random data series under analysis. And then your number 7, of course, is the discussion of the results. That is alluding to the theoretical and the empirical literature. It's not the rehashing of the results, but it's just the discussion of the salient features of the results which would have been presented, right from the graphical analysis, the descriptive analysis, or tabular analysis, or tabular presentation, with the brief analysis under the table, brief introduction before the table, brief analysis under the table, and then the diagnostic tests, which are the unit root tests for testing stationarity, like your Phillips-Perron and the augmented Dickey-Fuller test, and the Johansen co-integration test for long-run association, the Granger causality test to check the direction of causality, the collinearity test to check whether your explanatory variables have got a linear relationship among themselves, and then the heteroscedasticity test to check whether your random variables are not homoscedastic. That is, their variance does not change as the time series either increases over time or decreases over time. And then we have got number 4, which is the model parameter presentations in form of tables and their analysis. And then number 5, the robustness test results. And then number 6, the forecasting test results. And number 7 is the discussion of the results in light of the theoretical and the empirical literature. And once that is done, ladies and gentlemen, you write your brief conclusion or chapter summary. This brings me to the conclusion of the layout for chapter 4. Now I go to the final chapter of most dissertations or research projects for undergraduate and master's degree students. Because as I said, for PhD students, we can't generalize. The chapters vary. Most PhD theses that I've read, especially in the field of finance, economics, econometrics, statistics, and so on, I've realized that the shortest will be having 6 chapters, and the longest they'll be having 10 or even 12 chapters. So I can't provide a layout for independent research. But for guided research like undergraduate and master's degree level research, I can provide a layout to assist our researchers who are pursuing various degrees or courses. So without much ado, the name of the final chapter in our department, the Department of Banking at the Faculty of Commerce at the National University of Science and Development, at the National University of Science and Technology in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. The name of, or the title of the chapter is Research Findings, Conclusions and Recommendations. As is the case with other chapters, it has got 3 parts, which is the introduction, the body, and the conclusion or the chapter summary. And as is the case with other chapters, the longest part is the body, which comprises of 4 major parts. The 4 major parts are: 1, research findings. That is the main research findings. They have to be summarized. So some they summarize under, neatly crafted subheadings which conform to those main findings. Others they summarize in just separate paragraphs under one main, subheading entitled Key Research Findings or Main Research Findings or Main Findings of the Study or Main Results of the Study, because the naming of sections or subsections is not cast on stone. Number 2, after one has exhausted summarizing the main research findings, they go to the key research conclusions. Now, in the key research conclusions, the researcher has to afford as their research conclusions vis-a-vis the findings that they would have presented in the preceding section. And these research conclusions, they must refer back to either the theoretical or the empirical literature or both, so that we can see how the knowledge gap has been closed, whether it has been closed by way of divergence or convergence in terms of reasoning, or by way of introducing completely new material, which is neither agreeing nor disagreeing with the existing literature, but just adding new thoughts or new dimensions of understanding phenomenon or the phenomenon which was being studied. So each and every paragraph, each and every section will show an allusion to some authors that this study concludes that mobile banking has enabled people in rural areas to be able to enjoy banking services. This is corroborated by Ndlovu and Ndlovu in their start of mobile banking in Kwanda and so on. And then you go to another research conclusion, you put across your research conclusion, and then you also allude to the literature, either the theoretical or the empirical literature or both. And then after you are done with summarizing your research conclusions and referring back to the literature, you go to number 3, which is recommendations of the study. And these recommendations of the study are usually policy recommendations to corporate entities, that is private sector companies or the for-profit commercial entities. And then B is the non-profit organizations, which may include NGOs, associations, think tanks, your labor unions and so on, organizations that exist to fight for or to improve the welfare of certain specific sections of society. Those policy recommendations can be made to them. And then the government, of course, receives policy recommendations, including specific government departments like your Zimbabwe National Water Authority, your Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, and so on. And then policy recommendations are also made to certain stakeholders in society and to the economy as a whole, including, including everyone in a society. And then E is the international community. And then after the policy recommendations have been exhausted, they should not be too long. They are just written or presented in brief paragraphs. We move on to the 4th part, which is suggestions for future research or for further study, which are also brief. And then we have got the conclusion of chapter 5, which is either called the chapter summary or concluding remarks. So I'm done with the layout of the research project from chapter 1, which is a mirror reflection of your research proposal. But in a lecture tomorrow, I will actually summarize the layout of chapter 1 together with the preliminary pages, especially for our students at the Department of Banking under the Faculty of Commerce at the National University of Science and Technology. I know I've taken quite a bit of time to present the layout of these two chapters. That is your chapter 4, which is the analysis, presentation, and discussion of results chapter, and chapter 5, which is the research findings, conclusions, and the recommendations chapter. But I believe that you have benefited and that the generic structure will go a long way in assisting you to craft your own chapter subheadings that are related and linked to each other in a chronological way or in a chronological manner. Thank you so much for listening in. Remember to subscribe to my channel, to my teaching channel, because every now and then I drop in new materials to assist not only our students at the National University of Science and Technology, but also students from other countries, because issues to do with research tend to be generic. And in a forthcoming video, tomorrow I said, I will be just summarizing the preliminary pages issues, like your cover page of the research project, and also covering issues to do with appendices and all of that stuff, where to put the, the letter of introduction, the questionnaire itself, the interview schedule, some results which are too long, how to, include them under the appendices section and all of that stuff. So I'll be presenting it in a lecture that will come tomorrow, the 26th of January 2022. So once more, remember to like and to subscribe to my channel and disseminate this video to as many as you can reach of your friends as possible who are also undertaking research or interested in undertaking degree studies, either at an undergraduate level or at a master's degree level, which have got a research component, including those who are pursuing PhDs. They may get one or two, lessons on the layout that I just presented for use as something which is generic. Thank you so much for listening in. Have a good day.